Hey, it's Marcel. Let me get honest with you for a minute. We've reached a time in history when building up strong leaders truly matters if you want to grow your business. But managing through fear, command and control, and do as I say ways of managing is not going to get you there. So, what will? In my research, I found that the most effective leadership boils down to six key behaviors. They are behaviors that, when filtered down to every management level, can create high performance in your teams and build a great work culture. By the way, this is the new topic that I speak on at company events and conferences and virtual stages all over the world. It's great for keynotes, webinars, half-day or full-day workshops, and leadership retreats. So if you want to learn a clear and practical framework to help design the best work environment for your people to flourish, this is the way to go, and I can show you how to do it. To book me for your event, visit my website, marcelschwantes.com, and click on Speaking. Enjoy the show.
The future of work isn't about shareholder value, technology, metrics, or automation. It's about being human and putting people first through actionable love. Welcome to the Love in Action podcast, where we hold deep conversations with extraordinary people to help you grow as a leader and expand your business. Here's your host, Marcel Schwantes.
Hey, glad you are here. Happy Thursday. Hope you're having a great one. And thanks for joining us. We're grateful and honored that you chose to spend time with us. And if you like what you hear, please let someone else know about it and share it on social media, because doing so is going to help us to get to our goal of 1 million downloads. Got a great show for you today. Sally Helgesen will be joining us shortly for her second round. Sally was last with us back in 2019, before the world went to hell in the handbasket, right? And she was here to promote her last book, the international bestseller, How Women Rise. Well, she released another one earlier this year called Rising Together, How We Can Bridge Divides and Create a More Inclusive Workplace. There's the cover if you're watching on YouTube. Now, this is an important book in the DEI conversation, and I know we're in for a great discussion because, as you longtime listeners know, this podcast, we're all about giving you practical strategies and steps to address your toughest leadership challenges. And I know that's why you come here. And when it comes to the topic of inclusion, most of us, we're leaders here on the show, right? We got CEOs listening, and you guys are smart enough to know why developing and retaining a diverse workforce is important, right? You get it. The problem is that so many of us don't know how to do it. So Sally is going to provide that missing how-to piece of the puzzle by identifying what holds us back and then giving us some practices that can help us move forward. Sally Helgesen, cited in Forbes as the world's premier expert on women's leadership, is an internationally best-selling author, speaker, and leadership coach, honored by the Thinkers 50 Hall of Fame. Her previous books include the aforementioned How Women Rise, co-authored with Marshall Goldsmith, The Female Advantage, The Female Vision, Women's Real Power at Work, and The Web of Inclusion, which, if you have that book, you may not know this, was cited in the Wall Street Journal as one of the best books on leadership of all time. Sally now joins us. Welcome back, my friend, to the Love in Action podcast.
Thank you, Marcel. It's so wonderful to be with you again.
Likewise, 4 years later. Sally, it's like no pandemic, no social, racial unrest. So many things have happened. So what's been going on in your world for the last 4 years?
Well, my work mostly switched to virtual, and I didn't realize what a fantastic relief that would be. I had spent about 30 years on the road and all over the world, constantly traveling. So what happened in my world was I've been sitting in my home office, and just started traveling again this year. But it has been really interesting. And I feel that I've been able to, ironically, reach far more people.
Yeah.
You know, be in Sao Paulo, Nigeria in the morning and Sao Paulo in the afternoon.
So it's quite fun. Yeah, it's safe to say that you're probably back to your pre-pandemic days as far as traveling goes?
I was, but I finally, after 3 years and 3 months, managed to get COVID in May. So I had to cancel everything. So I've been very much here.
All right. So we got this new tradition that, well, you didn't get this question 4 years ago. You ready?
Exactly.
Okay. We start the show now with this, Sally. What's your story?
My story is that I'm really a leadership expert who never intended to be a leadership expert. In the mid 80s, I was working in corporate communications, enjoying it. And but I saw that the companies I worked in, which were all excellent companies, had no idea what women could be contributing in any sense as leaders or a strategic sense. I heard some of the best ideas that I heard in the organization in what was called the Ladies' Lounge at that time. And I thought, this is information that leadership needs to know. So I decided to try to write a book on how the best women leaders, there weren't many of them at that time, how they led. So I could give a sense to organizations of what that was. Organizations weren't that interested in the message, but women were. And I started getting, letters in those days in response to what I'd written, saying, I didn't know I had a leadership style until I read this book. I thought it was just what I was doing, and I was doing it wrong. So that book was very successful and influential. So I stayed with it, wrote more books, The Web of Inclusion, as you know, the first time the word inclusion was used in the sense of organizations and business. So companies started inviting me in to speak and do programs and workshops, and I just stayed with it. It was fascinating and has continued to keep me highly engaged for now 35 years.
That's fantastic. So, okay, I got to bring this up because, and you mentioned it, the Web of Inclusion. Not many people know, and you've already said it, but I need to give you a proper acknowledgement, okay, folks, because Sally is the first person to write about inclusion in the context of the workplace back in 1995 with the book, The Web of Inclusion. But here's the thing, though, inclusion was a lot different than inclusion is in 2023. So tell us about how things have changed since you wrote that book.
Well, it's changed completely because the whole idea of diversity and inclusion, it didn't exist.
Right.
When I wrote about inclusion, it was really in response to technological change. That technology, our trusty laptops and, certainly we didn't have the phones at that time.
Yeah.
That people at every level were getting information and had capability that they'd never had. And yet organizations were still very hierarchically structured. So I was trying to propose a new way of operating and a new structure for organizations to understand what they needed, how they needed to operate, given the empowerment, as we've been talking about for quite a while.
Because they were getting access to information so fast, even back in the 90s.
Exactly. The military was doing a great job of it at that time. They understood it. But most corporations were at sea. So that's what I was trying to deal with. It had nothing to do with the whole issue of workforce diversity. But within about 2 or 3 years, organizations began to also see, hey, the workplace is changing. This is a global world we're operating in, and we need to get better at attracting and retaining diverse employees. So this was happening in the late 90s. So because I had a book called The Web of Inclusion, they kept bringing me in to talk about inclusion. So that's why I say it was highly accidental, but as accidental things are often, it was just right.
Yeah.
So that got me really fascinated by this whole field of how do we build a workplace that works for people at every level and works for people from remarkably different backgrounds, often with different values. How do we do that? So that's been kind of the question that has kept me motivated and excited for all these decades.
And that's a great segue to Rising Together. So let's kind of get into it, but start at the 30,000 foot level, Sally. What's the big idea behind this new book of yours?
I would say the big idea behind the new book is that in terms of how we've been trying to do diversity in the workplace, we've gotten sidetracked with the whole unconscious bias conversation. It's very theoretical, really. It exists in people's minds. It doesn't give people much of a how. And my wake-up call around Rising Together really happened when I was doing a construction super conference in Las Vegas. And I was doing a women's leadership workshop. So I expected, it was a huge thing. It took up both the Wynn hotels there. And it was all these guys, guys in construction.
Yeah.
And I expected that I would have, maybe 100, 150 women who were struggling to make their voices heard would show up. And instead, when I went down to the room, of course, the ratio in general was about 20 men to 1 woman. There were about 60 or 70% men. And I was stunned. And what I prepared to say was suddenly completely inappropriate. So I was scrambling a little bit. So I did what we all do and said, tell me why you came here. And it was really interesting because it was not surprising. We need to do a better job of attracting and retaining. But then this one executive stood up and he said, listen, please don't waste your time, meaning their time, telling us why we need to get better at this. As you said at the beginning of the show, we get it, but we have no idea how to do it. And I had been in my, being very involved in this D&I or DEI or DEIB, they keep adding letters.
Right.
I've been very involved in this for a long time, was concerned about the unconscious bias focus. And I thought, this whole thing has gotten way too theoretical. We need the hows. How do we do this? How do we deal with the emotions that are stirred by the kinds of encounters we're more likely to have in a workplace that's extremely diverse with people who are really different? And we may not exactly know how to talk to them. How do we do that? How do we deal with issues of, provocations around things like fairness when we feel people are being promoted, getting jobs we expected to get? And also, how do we practice inclusion? What's really concrete? So I thought this is the big question that I think needs to be addressed. And that's why I wrote Rising Together.
Yeah. And some of the things that you mentioned are triggers, and you identified 8 common triggers that undermine our ability to connect with our coworkers, right? That may be different than us, or like you said, they have different values, beliefs, and even histories that different than our own. So I'm guessing that I've seen this in my own coaching sessions when I'm advising clients, that sometimes when they rub up against certain people at work that may come from different backgrounds, ethnicity, sexual orientations, and interact with them and experience their world, they may get offended. And so now we got drama. Or they may get resentful, and now they can't collaborate because they're hanging on to these emotions. So anyway, so all that to say, they got triggered, right? So is that where we're leading this, and does that kind of help explain what those triggers are when you say that you've identified triggers?
Yes, it does. I took the word triggers, I grabbed it from my dear colleague, Marcel Goldsmith, who'd written a book on triggers, but I thought, I want to look how this applies specifically to things that have to do with interactions with people from different ethnicities, races, gender, sexuality, age. That's a big one. And look at those triggers specifically rather than triggers in general. Now, it's important to understand what a trigger is. A trigger is a situation or a person or a comment that stirs an emotional response in us. It can be anger, it can be resentment, it can be shock, it can be horror, whatever. It can be love. That can be a triggering response as well. But it's the important thing is it is situational. It lies outside ourselves. It is outside of our circle of control, and yet it can become very strongly part of our circle of concern, to use Stephen Covey's fantastic old model. So the issue is not the trigger. The issue is we cannot control our environment. And I think that people haven't accepted that enough. We can't control our environment. What we can control is, and we can't really control the emotional response at first. That's not bad. That's not a bad thing. It's what do we do with that? How do we address that? How do we find, and I have come to see the central question in Rising Together, how do we find a positive path forward for ourselves and potentially for a colleague who has triggered us, despite the fact that we have these emotions? How do we do that? So that's what I'm trying to address in triggers.
Yeah. All right. So I love to get to the solution part of how do we manage our emotions to deflect away triggers, but let's get into what some of the triggers are, because we may be experiencing and really not know that it's there, right? So you identified 8. We don't have time for all 8. So let's start with, I picked out 3. So let's start with the trigger of visibility.
Visibility is a huge trigger, and I hear about it all the time in the workplace. We can, if we feel that we struggle to be visible, that is noticed for what we contribute, we can feel resentful toward people who are good at visibility. If we are good at visibility, we can also feel triggered by people who are not good at it. If they can't speak up for themselves, it's not my problem. I can't help them. They're, not a player. So we can get into sort of labeling someone who's struggling with visibility rather than thinking, oh, you know what, maybe it's tough for them in that meeting because there's nobody else like them. What can we do to help that situation? But let's go back to our old friend being triggered by people who are good at visibility. Because I've dealt with this for so long, because it's very common with women. The typical example, which I still hear, I've heard this for 35 years, and I've experienced it too. You're sitting in a room, you say something, no one responds. Then 3 minutes later, 5 minutes later, 10 minutes later, a man, often with higher status than you, says something very similar, or maybe even the exact same thing. Whoa, great idea, terrific. I like that. People respond to him, and it's like, okay, am I here? Do I exist? Does anybody notice that I said that first? So what do? If you say, I said that first, bad idea. You're triggered, essentially. You're triggered. Mm-hmm. So if you say, I said that first or whatever, that's never going to work. A default action that many people in that situation take is to say nothing, and then as they leave, grab a friend. Can you believe what just happened again? These guys don't get it, et cetera, et cetera. This happens with people of color all the time as well. So it's very hard emotion to deal with, and we've got a lot of bad ways of dealing with it. So what do? And this is kind of the overriding idea with triggers. What is most helpful are 2 things. Number 1, writing a kind of new script to explain what just happened. Maybe he didn't hear me. Maybe he was rephrasing what I said because a couple of words, which I wouldn't necessarily recognize, will make it more understandable to the people in the room. Maybe he was actually confirming what I said, but he didn't happen to mention my name. It doesn't matter. Here's the thing. It doesn't matter if we believe this, or we actually believe that he was just ignoring us or even trying to poach our idea. Doesn't matter. Telling ourselves this different story gives us a potential positive path forward. We can go up to the guy afterwards. So glad you liked my idea. Would you like to get together and talk about how we might be able to move this forward? I think this is something the whole team could benefit from. If we don't do that afterwards, if we don't figure out our new script until the next day, send an email or a text or whatever mode of communication and say the same thing. And what's good about this is that by writing this different script, again, doesn't matter if you don't believe it, you can move forward. You can have a share in claiming that idea and being part of a solution. But even more importantly, you have a path to try to engage this guy who triggered you as a collaborator, a colleague, as an ally by making that kind of approach. So that's a really, really powerful tool to use when you're triggered, is rewriting a script. And with visibility, it's very easy to see how to do that.
Wow. So I know people that have been stuck in victim mode because they are hearing the same script play out in their heads over and over and over again. And and which, of course, will lead to them being triggered because they're listening to those voices the voices are no longer serving them well and haven't, but they're stuck. So they can't change the script. So here's the question, though. At what point will somebody realize, or maybe have the self-awareness to know, I need to change the script in my head in order to respond differently? How do you get to that aha moment?
It's very hard to do that if you're only in your own head. So, this is where coaching comes in often. It's very helpful, but everybody doesn't have a coach. I think that peer coaching, finding someone who you can really talk through your workplace issues in a positive way, not like, can you believe that happened again? Or that person's such a jerk, or, this organization will never, whatever that kind of conversation is. Having people who you can talk to about things that trigger you, about workplace issues you're having, who can help you see the essential question of therapy, which is, what part might I be playing in this? And often the part that you're playing in it is that you have this negative internalized script. Now, I will say that I do think that the general culture these days encourages people to feel as if they're victims, no matter what level of privilege they have. And let's face it, many of us in the West enjoy world historic levels of privilege. And yet you still find people who feel, victimized. And this is not surprising, given, again, the diversity of the workplace and the likelihood of these kind of misunderstandings. I believe that the whole language around microaggressions has been extremely harmful because it puts people on the alert, watching out for, how their, what their values, what their authentic beliefs, how those have been infringed. I was talking to a woman the other day who said she asked for something in a store and they didn't have it. And she was asking a couple more follow-up questions. And the clerk said to her, "You're triggering me." This is okay. We don't live in It's not her job to make sure she never triggers. She said, I wasn't yelling at her. I wasn't doing anything like that. So we've fallen into, this kind of way of thinking that's not very constructive. We need a way out. I think this is a good one.
That's good. That's good, Sally. I want to bring back something that you said that really stuck to me. So, and I think it's when we keep hearing the same things over and over, we get into confirmation bias. We want to surround ourselves with people that think like us so that they agree with us and it keeps us stuck in that path. And I think that we got to get out of our own echo chambers and surround ourselves with more diverse points of view. To me, that's a case for diversity that people don't usually touch on is to be able to have somebody push back against your assumptions and challenge your thinking, right? To help you to change your script.
Exactly. And a good coach, as you know, and I know, challenges you. Right. Have you thought about it this way? But what often, even with people, when I encourage people to do peer coaching, when I come back, what they've done is basically cement one another. So look for more diverse people, look for people who may have very different perceptions than you do, and run this by. I'm really bothered by what happened in that meeting. And can I explain to you what happened and how it made me feel? This is best done in the meeting, of course, and get your impression, because I need to find a way past it. So you're announcing already that your intention is to move past this, not to go on and on about how, people, didn't understand what and you feel like a victim. So you are announcing that intention. You're not there to gossip. You're not there to bond with people based on negativity. You are asking them because you really recognize you need to move past it. You need to take responsibility for that. That's why the scripts are so useful. Marcel, I should say, a disclaimer here, this is not meant as a technique for dealing with real issues of discrimination, of harassment, of racism, of blatant sexism at all. That does not need a script rewritten. But these small provocations that happen throughout the day and happen to all of us, we do need to understand good ways to address them positively.
Yeah, and it's those small provocations that we deal with on a normal course of the day, and those are the things that we're speaking of. And thank you for clarifying that, by the way. That was an important disclaimer. All right, the second trigger I want to cover is one that's I'm really interested in discussing. This one. It's the trigger of what are you trying to say? Explain that one.
Well, one of the consequences of being in such a diverse workplace is that we often don't know how to respond to what someone says. I had an example on Saturday. This is not in the workplace, but went to a big birthday party for some friends. And one of the a woman we know there, her formerly daughter is transitioning into being a man. And so she came up to me and I'd heard something about this. I said, oh, do you have a different name now? And she told me her new name. And I said, well, wonderful. I said, I used the name. And then I said, you look just the same. She did. She looked just the same. And this obviously triggered her. And she said, I have spent enormous amounts of money and undergone terrible pain to look different. And now you're telling me I look the same. So I thought, okay, I'm a certain age. I haven't talked to a lot of younger people who are in transition. And I didn't say this to her. And so I didn't, I sort of stepped in it, I guess. And she was clearly, triggered and angry. And this is a more extreme example of things that happen in the workplace all the time. And I hear people say, I'd love to talk to so-and-so, but I'm afraid of offending her. I'd love to talk to so-and-so, but I'm not quite sure of the correct words to use for someone from that culture. And a lot of the training about dealing with people in different cultures has been very technical. Like if you're talking to someone, raised in the Islamic faith, never show the bottom of your shoe to them. I don't know. Don't cross your legs so they can see the bottom of your shoe. Okay, maybe it's hard to remember. Is it really that important? We don't. At bottom, we're very focused on the details rather than sort of sharing our love and our heart with people from very different, who have, I don't want to say different backgrounds, but people who have different concerns or may have very, very different values.
Yeah.
So what's helpful is how do we communicate with that? We don't want to go into the workplace with a list of all kinds of things. Here's what to say to this person. Here's what to say to that person. Because guess what? That just emphasizes the differences between people rather than the commonalities. What we're trying to do in the workplace. We're trying to, be part of we're trying to build a collaborative team. We're trying to land this customer or client, whatever it is, going in with all these ideas about how to communicate with people who are different can kind of hold that back. So what we really want to do, I think, is first of all, be very clear in our speech and not just sort of generic, because that can be confusing. We want to focus. I mean, it's interesting because when I coach people on this, sometimes people will say, well, speaking that way is not authentic to me and I have to be my authentic self. Okay, fine. That's nice. But being professional in a situation and being clear about your intentions and engaging from your heart is a lot more important in this world than always trying to demonstrate your own authenticity. And this is kept us in our own heads. So there are lots of examples, especially around age. That's been an interesting one. A little bit what was going on with that young person in transition that I talked to, especially around age. People who've been around a long time, like myself, you probably less long, but been out there, will feel often, I don't know how to communicate with these kids, or what's wrong with them. They don't call me back on the phone. They're not comfortable using a phone. They tell me their pronouns. I don't want to hear their pronouns. And one of the things I learned in the book was that one of the biggest complaints that younger people have is that the older generation in the workplace never learns their names or never learns to pronounce their names. And it's that discomfort that people are demonstrating with a name that's unfamiliar to them. Get over it. It's a diverse workplace. Naming options are much broader. If you don't recognize the name, you don't know how to pronounce it, ask once, write it down, rehearse it, and then, don't make the same mistake again. So we learn by doing. And there are a lot of minefields here. Yeah. So we really need ways to demonstrate what our goodwill and our intention is, or keep the conversation on track.
All right. The last trigger I want to cover is trigger number 5 in the book. And you label it as it's not fair. Explain that one.
It's not fair has become really pervasive. I mean, I hear it all the time. I hear it from women, our workplace isn't fair. We still really favor, traditional white men. People of color feel it's not fair. White people are, have advantages we never had. But white men also, it's not fair around here. They're trying to promote women and minorities, and I'm not really getting a break, and I'll never be able to advance in this company because, so, we're all triggered by this. Guess what? It's real. It's not fair. It's not necessarily the fairest workplace in the world. Many are making great strides to try to be more fair, but unfairness is built into human life. We had a tornado hit here last night. We didn't get hardly any damage. The people down the road got their roof taken off and lost their car. It's not fair. Tell it to the tornado. We can't really assure. And I think this focus on meritocracy, and we're a meritocracy here, has kind of led us astray. It's not fair. White men have had a massive advantage for the last 100 years in the workplace. And it's not fair. Now there's an effort to try to bring other kinds of people forward because it makes it very tough to hire people of color and women if they don't see anybody at the top who looks like them. That becomes, that makes it tough. So this is what organizations are trying to do. So the big argument then theoretically is it's not fair. Okay, yeah, tell me something new. But we don't feel that because we are so triggered by fairness. Understandably, it really cuts to the bottom of our self-esteem and our ability, to make a contribution and be recognized for our contributions. So what I think is useful, and this is where the script writing business can come in, is when someone is promoted into a position or hired into a position that we ourselves expected that we might get, rather than the automatic default to it's not fair because, they're only promoting people of color, whatever. How about, maybe there's some things I don't know about what they were looking for in this job. The example I have in the book, which is a great one, is a woman who assumed that the fellow that had been hired over her into leading a team, she found herself reporting to him. They'd been colleagues before. She assumed it was because he was a guy. In fact, it was because the company, quite rightly, saw him as much more interested in a managerial position and her as a very creative type that she'd spent most of her career sort of enjoying and proving that she was. So the only reason she found that out is because she asked him, why do you think you got this job and I didn't get this job? I'm going to be honest with you. I thought I was going to get it, and I thought I was the qualified person, and you got it. So I want to hear your thoughts about why that was. So by talking to him in that way, she was able to learn. She re-examined her idea about why he got that job. She was able to tamp down her emotion, and guess what? She developed him as a useful ally who helped her over the next 10 years and helped her identify how she really wanted to use her talents in the organization.
So in that example, it's basically she didn't have all the information. And so she, instead of reacting by getting triggered with it's not fair, she went out to understand and she used her curiosity to find out, okay, what am I missing here? And she was able to, yeah. And to me, Sally, that speaks again goes right back to the scripts that play out in our head. Because we may be thinking and believing something that is not there. And rather than going and seeking out information, talking to people and asking questions like she did to get to the root of, so that's what happened. So, and I love that because it raises our self-awareness and makes a case for emotional intelligence instead of seeing the world as polar opposites, black and white, and even if you want to go the political route, that's to me what is so divisive now is that we tend to just entrench ourselves into left-right thinking and ideologies. We're not exploring and coming to the middle and trying to understand the other person.
That's exactly right. And we develop a whole story about that other person because, they drive a certain kind of truck. We've got a script in our head about that person. And then, and it's really interesting because, for example, let's take the guy in the truck with huge American flags flying and, somebody makes an assumption about him. Guess what? Their car breaks down. Who comes along? He comes along. he's really good fixing their car when it broke down. They sit there by the side of the road. They have an actual conversation. And then they come away thinking, he's really a good guy. After all, I didn't realize it. So that's the thing. These scripts prevent us from reaching out until we're forced to reach out. I want to make clear that the woman who had that conversation with her colleague was extremely triggered and spent about a month seething with resentment and anger. And what she realized is this was really getting in her way and blowing up her job. And that's when she went and asked him in a very neutral way, which she managed, to help her understand what had happened. So this goes back to what we were talking about, Marcel, earlier about getting a diverse range of people as our peer coaches, sounding board, allies, whatever you want to call them, because then we get different kinds of points of view. And that's what she did. She went to somebody who had a very different orientation toward work and who was, a man who was typical of the leadership in that those financial services company. And she got information that transformed her career.
Exactly. All right. So I want to touch on the second part of your book, which really focuses on the inclusive behaviors, in practicing these inclusive habits on a daily basis. And that's the part that speaks to me, because now we're talking about solutions and moving forward, et cetera. So, you already talked about how we need to emphasize behavior versus biases. So what's a good starting point for you? Because I want you to pick out what you feel is, it comes up for you.
Well, what comes up for me, first of all, and this is the essence of rewriting the scripts, it's generosity, or what I call in the book, and this is key, giving others the benefit of our goodwill. Now, this is not the benefit of the doubt, because that comes from a fairly negative, I'm going to give them the benefit of a doubt here. No, the benefit of our goodwill. And that's what writing a positive script really does, in addition to giving us a path forward. So I think actively thinking, what can I do to offer this person the benefit of my goodwill? It's a question about generosity. It's a question about grace, as John Baldoni, our colleague, points out. And that's kind of a guiding thing here. Now, in concrete, specific practice, what does that mean? What that means are all kinds of sort of micro positive behaviors as opposed to microaggressions. Micro behavior that's very important is thinking about, if we're structuring a meeting, who are we going to include? Who are we going to invite? Let's invite people that aren't on the regular list. Let's invite some younger employees to give them a chance to see what's going on here. And by the way, when we invite them, don't do a common practice, which is seat them in the back of the room, or, bring them right up front. Don't put them in a position so that if they say something, their boss has to turn around because they're seated behind them. Be sensitive about the seating and the design to really send that message that you're including these people. You want them to have this experience, that there's some things they can learn, that they also will probably get to see senior people acting like jerks at certain moments, and that's fine. That's part of it too. So that's a really important thing. If one practice from the Web of Inclusion, which I saw demonstrated at the Miami Herald, which was one of the case studies in that book, was the publisher had the practice of always including the squeaky wheel in every meeting, including the person who was the biggest pain on a specific issue in any meeting that was about that issue. Because usually what we do is we try to make sure, let's make sure Vivian doesn't come because she'll talk our ear off about this. She'll always have a problem. She'll always have an objection. And Dave Lawrence, the publisher of the Herald, said, include that person because it will make your work easier. Because when you come to consensus, people throughout the organization will say, wow, well, if Vivian signed off on it, they must be really serious. It must be a positive thing. Nominating people for awards, asking people, something came across my desk. This happens to us all the time, asking for nominations for this kind of award internally in the sector. It doesn't matter. I was thinking I would nominate you. Would that be useful? Can you send me some information? You can do this even if you're younger. You don't need to be in a position of authority. If we're in a position of authority, if we're a leader, asking people, what is it how do you see your career unfolding, either here or elsewhere, if that's in the picture? I'd love to know, because I may be able to be helpful, introduce you to people, put you in situations where you can expand your relationships and build new skills that will be useful to you. So those are really concrete, specific, inclusive behaviors and practiced across lines of gender, race, ethnicity, age, etc. Very, very powerful.
So one of the inclusive behaviors that kind of popped out at me, may be counterintuitive if you're an extrovert, if you like to be upfront, and you called it falls under active listening, and it's speaking last. That's hard if you're an extreme extrovert, somebody that's brash and charismatic. What did you mean by speaking last?
Oh, it's something I have a very hard time with. I saw it because I'm fortunate enough to have spent some time with Peter Drucker back in the 90s when he was so active, and he was, the big idol of most people who were in the leadership field. And what was fascinating was in every setting, and sometimes these settings were very, people who were kind of all over the map in a meeting. In every setting, Peter always spoke last. That was one of his rules for himself. And he said, well, I do that partly because I'm generally the most senior person in the room, and I know people won't say what they need to say if I speak first, because then they'll all be confirming what I said. So I want to actually hear what they have to say. He said, but for me also, it's a really great way to learn about people, is to give them a chance and not suck up all the air. He said, I already know what I think. I know what my opinions are. I want them to be changed when I walk in to a room of other people. So it was a very powerful practice. Of course, it had the impact of making Peter seem like the most authoritative person in the room rather than the opposite. Most of us who go into a meeting and are the first one raising the hand, I include myself, it diminishes that authority, in fact. So it was a very powerful practice, but also people felt it in their hearts. They really felt, oh, wow, I sat in a meeting and Peter Drucker listened to what I had to say. That was immensely moving.
I love it. Sally, do you have another one? Let's take one more inclusive behavior we need to practice. What else?
Yeah, I think that it really has to do with what I talked about earlier with names. That is an inclusive behavior. It's a communication technique, but it's also inclusive behavior. Being very respectful of what people's names are. If they offer, this is my pronoun, fine. No commentary is needed. Oh, you need to have a pronoun? No, you don't. And being aware that when we're in a position of leadership, very small things can have an impact. In the book, I use an example of a CEO I worked with who was in the petroleum industry and down in Houston. And he was a great guy. And I went into his office, very inclusive, leader, really trying to work in that industry. And I went to his office and he had this sign on his desk and it said, be brief, be brilliant, and be gone. And I said, Jack, that doesn't really sound like you. And he said, how did that get there? And he said, oh, someone gave it to me. I thought it was kind of funny. And I said, you have to realize the impact you have upon people given your position. And anybody who sees that sign is going to feel inhibited from speaking to you. So I think recognizing that these very small things that we can say, and the small things we can do, and the things we can say we think are funny, can really have an outsized impact. So we want to watch that. Carefully, but we also want to ask people, what do you think of this sign? How do you think people would react to this? Here's something I'm going to say in this talk. You have a lot in common with people in this audience. How do you think this would be? Don't try to do it in your own head. The most important thing here, doesn't matter. We've got a lot of sort of dichotomies, introvert, extrovert. Where do you fall on the scale? That's nice. But the important thing is really, really being able to engage other people, build the strongest and most diverse network of allies and people that you talk to. That is possible to do. And so try things out on them.
Yeah. Sally, as we wind down here, we pose you the leadership love question. It's tradition on the show. I'm so curious what you're going to say to this one. So how do we lead our businesses and organizations, our employees with more practical and actionable love day in and day out?
I think be on the lookout for opportunities and put a sign on our desk. Give others the benefit of our goodwill. To me, that is love in action. Frances Hesselbein, who was a great mentor to me, wrote this wonderful book called Work is Love Made Visible. And in it, she talks about trying to create environments where people feel loved. Having someone extend goodwill to you, even in a situation where you may not have necessarily earned it, is to me the practice of love made visible.
Perfect. All right, we bring it home. I wish we didn't get to this because I could talk to you for hours, but we bring it home with two questions, as we do with every guest. Personally, what's really tugging at your heart right now that you'd like us to know?
What's tugging at my heart is concern and fascination with this backlash to the whole DEI in the corporate and in organizational world from the political world. And I don't think it's going to be successful. I think the whys for organization of the need to recruit talent broadly are strong enough and intense enough to keep the path we've been on intact with some modifications, with greater focus on behavior, not bias, with not trying to get into people's minds, which is kind of invasive if you think about it. Don't tell me what to think. No, but some suggestions about how I might behave more constructively with people that I'm not sure I know how to behave constructively with, that would be useful. So I think we've got some adjustments to make in the whole world of diversity and inclusion about how we're delivering this. But the commitment to it, I think, is strong. But there's, and we saw it, we don't know what the Supreme Court's going to do next couple terms, but the commitment to it is strong, but it's going to be there definitely, as we see with a company like Disney, some serious headwinds.
Yeah, thank you for that. Finally, you close us out your way. What's that one thing, that one key takeaway you'd like to leave us with?
One key takeaway I'd like to leave us with is don't try to do this alone. Don't try to practice different behaviors and adjust your mindset and write new scripts, etc. alone. Marshall Goldsmith had some fantastic research that he did a number of years ago with a colleague. that tried to look at what people who were able to make positive, sustainable behavioral change, what they had in common. And what they had in common was they didn't do it alone. They worked with a coach, they had a peer coach, they had support, they had a network. We can all get better at creating positive networks that, you read the book, don't have grapevine characteristics, which are kind of gossip networks, but building those positive networks and getting really upfront with people. Hey, I'm trying to do this. Not sure I'm doing a great job with it. What do you think? How did that go? Give me some, is there anything I could do differently next time?
Sally, it's been wonderful having you. And it's a given. The next book that you write, you're going to be right back on the show again. So thank you so much for joining us. Your wisdom and your knowledge, it's great. We want to pass that on to help increase our understanding of how to be more diverse and how to be more inclusive the right way. And you did that so well today. Thank you.
Thank you.
And lastly, if people want to connect with you and find out more about you, where can they go? Point them to a couple of places.
Well, terrific. My website, sallyhelgesen.com. It has a contact button, so you can get in touch with me. People do every single day come in through the contact button. So certainly that's one. I have a Substack newsletter that I've been doing for about 2 years. Took a little break with this COVID, but I'm back to it. So you can find that on Substack, again, on the website, and get right there, or just Google it. And LinkedIn, and for a while, at least more Twitter. Haven't set up Threads yet, but that's where you can find me. I'm active.
Perfect. Rising Together is the book. Again, grab it wherever books are sold. And again, thank you, Sally. It's been wonderful chatting with you.
Thank you, Marcel. I really enjoyed this hour.
You can keep the conversation going on social media with hashtag Love in Action Podcast, and also look for my show notes as well as a YouTube link to watch the show on my website, marcelschwantes.com. And finally, if you're interested in sponsoring an episode of this show, hey, let's chat. Reach me on my website or find me on LinkedIn.
Thank you for listening to the Love in Action podcast. If you enjoyed today's episode, please share it, subscribe, and leave us a review. Until next time, don't forget, the future of leadership is love in action. Believe it, practice it, and watch your business grow.